My childhood bully started dating my mom just weeks after my dad's death, that manipulated her into thinking I never cared about her and changed her will to only include himself. I drove back to my childhood home for the first time in 8 years, my hands shaking as I pulled into the driveway where my father would never again wave from the porch. The house looked better than it had in decades, with fresh paint, new gutters, and a garden that actually had flowers instead of weeds. That's when I saw him through the kitchen window, standing next to my grieving mother with his arm around her shoulders like he belonged there, like he was the son who'd never left her side. It was my high school bully, Christopher. He was in my kitchen making my mother laugh while she cooked dinner. My stomach dropped as memories flooded back of lockers slammed shut on my fingers and hallways where I'd learned to walk with my head down. I sat in my car for 10 minutes trying to process what I was seeing before finally walking to the front door. Mom opened it before I could knock, and her face lit up in a way I hadn't seen since before Dad died 3 months ago. She looked healthier somehow, and was wearing actual makeup instead of the pajamas she'd been living in during our video calls. Christopher appeared behind her, wiping his hands on a dish towel like he lived there. He smiled at me and extended his hand. "I'm Christopher, but everyone calls me Chris. You must be Danny. Your mom talks about you all the time." His grip was firm and confident, and I felt 17 again, standing there in my own doorway. Mom ushered us inside, chattering about how wonderful Chris had been helping with everything from grocery shopping to fixing the leaky faucet Dad never got around to. She kept touching his arm when she talked about him and looking at him like he'd saved her life. During dinner, Chris asked about my graphic design work in Portland and seemed genuinely interested in my answers. He mentioned staying local after graduation and how he'd always believed in taking care of family and community. Mom nodded along enthusiastically, and I caught her glancing between us like she was comparing. Chris helped clear the table without being asked and knew exactly where everything went in the kitchen. He had his own coffee mug with his name on it, and there were photos of him with Mom on the refrigerator that looked like they'd been taken over several weeks. When Mom went to get dessert, Chris leaned back in his chair and said, "Funny how life works out, isn't it? Small towns have a way of bringing people back together when they need each other most." I asked how long he'd been helping Mom, and he said he'd started coming around right after the funeral when he heard she was struggling. He just wanted to check on her since he remembered how kind she'd always been to everyone at school. The way he said it made it sound like a beautiful coincidence, but something felt calculated about his timing. After dessert, Chris mentioned he should head home, but Mom insisted he stay for coffee. She seemed almost panicked at the thought of him leaving, and I realized she'd grown dependent on his presence in a way that went beyond simple gratitude. Chris just smiled, that same predatory smile I remembered from high school hallways. When he finally left, Mom walked him to the door and hugged him goodbye. She came back inside glowing and immediately started praising him, saying, "He's been such a blessing, Danny. I don't know what I would have done without him these past few months. He's so mature and responsible, and he never makes me feel like a burden the way some people do." The emphasis on some people hit like a physical blow. I tried to explain that I'd been dealing with Dad's death too, and that my job required me to be in Portland, but Mom just shook her head. That night I was laying on the couch, since Chris had converted my old bedroom into what Mom called his workshop. I could hear Mom on the phone with someone, talking about how worried she was about me, and how grateful she was to have Chris's support during this difficult time with my adjustment issues. The next morning, Chris showed up at 7 with coffee and pastries from Mom's favorite bakery. He knew her order by heart. Over breakfast, he mentioned projects he was planning for the house, and spoke about the future like he'd be part of it permanently. Mom hung on his every word and agreed to everything he suggested. When I tried to join the conversation, Chris would redirect to something I couldn't contribute to, like local politics or people from high school I'd never kept in touch with. He had a way of making me feel like an outsider in my own family home. Later that day, while Mom was at the grocery store, Chris cornered me in the garage. He dropped his friendly mask completely and looked at me with those same cold eyes from senior year. He said, "It's amazing how easy it was to become everything you never were to her, Danny. She needed a son who actually cared enough to stick around, and the only son who deserves her inheritance." Then Mom's car pulled up, and his warm smile returned instantly as he went to help her with the groceries. That evening, Mom announced she was updating her will to include Chris, because family isn't just blood, it's who shows up for you. She looked directly at me when she said it, and I realized Chris had been positioning himself as my replacement from the moment he'd learned Dad died. I lay there staring at the ceiling, my mind racing through everything that had happened. The couch springs creaked as I shifted, trying to process how Chris had infiltrated our lives so completely. My phone buzzed with a text from Carol asking if I'd arrived safely. Not Mom anymore, just Carol and my contacts, because somewhere along the way, I'd started distancing myself, even in small ways. The next morning, I woke to Chris's voice in the kitchen. He was already there at 6:30, making breakfast and discussing plans for converting the garage into a home gym. Carol agreed to everything while I watched from the doorway, invisible to both of them. When I cleared my throat, Chris turned with that practiced smile and offered me coffee from my own father's favorite mug. I spent the morning trying to help around the house, but Chris had already handled everything. The gutters were cleaned, the lawn was mowed, even the attic was reorganized. Every task I suggested was met with Carol explaining how Chris had already taken care of it last week, last month, or was planning to do it tomorrow. My offers felt redundant, unwanted. Mrs. Patterson from next door knocked around noon, needing help with her late husband's medical bills. Both Chris and I moved toward the door, but Carol touched Chris's arm and asked if he could stay to help her with something in the kitchen. I volunteered to help Mrs. Patterson instead, partly to be useful and partly to escape the suffocating dynamic in my childhood home. The paperwork took 4 hours. Mrs. Patterson's dining table was covered in insurance forms, hospital bills, and Medicare statements. She kept apologizing for taking up my time, but I was grateful for the distraction. Her hands shook as she showed me bill after bill, and I helped her organize everything into a system that made sense. She mentioned how helpful Chris had been after her husband's funeral, bringing groceries and checking on her. Even here, his influence reached. When I finally returned home, Carol met me at the door with news that her lawyer would be coming tomorrow to discuss some estate matters. Behind her, I could see Chris installing something on the wall. The kitchen faucet was in pieces on the counter, and Chris was explaining how he'd noticed it was about to break completely. He'd already ordered the replacement parts and would have it fixed by evening. I offered to help with the faucet since I'd watched Dad fix it dozens of times over the years. Carol just patted my arm and said Chris had it handled. She trusted him with these things now. My knowledge of our house, accumulated over decades, was worthless compared to his 4 months of calculated helpfulness. That evening, I mentioned something about high school while Carol was in the bathroom. Just a casual comment about the old football field being turned into a parking lot. Chris's whole body tensed, and his breathing became rapid and shallow. His hands gripped the table edge as his face went pale. Carol rushed back at the sound of his gasping breaths, immediately cradling his head and glaring at me. She soothed him while scolding me for bringing up what were clearly painful memories. Chris leaned into her comfort, but I caught a flash of calculation in his eyes before they closed. Friday afternoon brought an unexpected visitor. Lily, Carol's 8-year-old granddaughter from her sister Janet, bounded through the door and went straight to Chris. She wrapped her arms around his waist and called him Uncle Chris, like they'd known each other forever. Carol beamed at the sight while my stomach churned. When had this relationship formed? How many family moments had I missed? Lily chattered about her week at school and showed Chris her drawings. He listened with apparent genuine interest, asking questions and praising her artwork. When she finally noticed me, she tilted her head and asked if I was the uncle who lived far away, the uncle who was too busy to visit. Chris had clearly been present for enough family gatherings to become the familiar face while I remained the stranger. Later, while Carol and Lily baked cookies, I found myself drawn to Chris's workshop. My old bedroom had been transformed completely. The walls held tools I didn't recognize, projects in various stages of completion. On the workbench sat my old high school yearbook, bookmarked with sticky notes. I moved closer, curious about what had caught his attention. The door burst open, and Lily stood there, flour in her hair and chocolate on her fingers. She looked between me and the yearbook with wide eyes before running back to the kitchen. I heard her innocent voice telling Carol that Uncle Danny was going through Uncle Chris's stuff. Carol's footsteps approached, heavy with disappointment. The confrontation was brief, but devastating. Carol stood in the doorway of what used to be my room, shaking her head. She reminded me about boundaries and respect for privacy. Chris appeared behind her, placing a protective hand on her shoulder. He said nothing, but his presence spoke volumes. I was the intruder here, violating the sanctity of his space in what used to be my home. That weekend, Dr. Martinez called the house. Carol's grief counselor needed a character reference for Chris, who had volunteered to help with other grieving families in the community. Carol practically glowed as she described Chris's compassion and dedication. She handed him the phone with such pride, like a mother watching her son receive an award. I sat across from them, invisible again. My behavior was becoming increasingly erratic from their perspective. The sleep deprivation from the uncomfortable couch made me irritable. I snapped at small things, paced the house at odd hours, and probably looked exactly like the unstable son Chris had been describing. Carol started watching me with concern, the same expression she'd worn during Dad's cancer diagnosis when I'd struggled to cope. The family group text for planning Dad's memorial service became a minefield. Every suggestion I made was screenshot by Chris and reframed in his responses. When I proposed having the service at Dad's favorite restaurant, Chris pointed out how that would exclude elderly family members who couldn't handle the noise. When I suggested a specific date, Chris had already checked with everyone and found conflicts. My contributions looked thoughtless compared to his careful consideration. Carol's sister Janet called the house one evening, her voice carrying from the kitchen where Carol had her on speaker. Janet was concerned about my behavior, specifically my obsessive questions about Chris. Apparently, Chris had mentioned to Janet's husband during golf that I seemed fixated on their friendship in an unhealthy way. Carol assured her sister that Chris was handling the situation with grace, despite my jealousy. The next morning brought another revelation. Chris had inherited Dad's golf club membership and his complete workshop tool collection. Carol explained that Dad would have wanted them to go to someone who would actually use them, someone who was here, who understood their value. The monthly dues were still being automatically deducted from Dad's account, now funding Chris's Sunday morning rounds with the family friends I'd never made time for. My exhaustion was becoming dangerous. One morning, after another sleepless night on the couch, I nearly crashed my car in the school parking lot. My reflexes were shot, and I veered too close to a parked car before correcting. Several parents witnessed the near miss, and by evening, Carol had heard about it through the neighborhood network. Chris suggested gently that maybe I should let him drive me places while I was visiting, for everyone's safety. Maria, Carol's best friend since college, stopped coming around. When I asked Carol about it, she sighed and explained that Maria's husband had given her an ultimatum about getting involved in family drama. Maria had called Carol privately, crying, saying she believed there were two sides to every story, but couldn't risk her marriage by taking sides. Another ally lost to Chris's careful campaign. The neighborhood Facebook group became another battlefield I didn't even know existed. Carol showed me her phone one evening, scrolling through a discussion about supporting each other through grief. 47 comments expressed concern about my behavior, my apparent inability to accept Carol's healing process, and praise for Chris's stabilizing presence. People I'd known since childhood were discussing my mental state like I was a problem to be solved. One afternoon, while Chris was at work, Carol mentioned something about security footage from the grocery store. She was trying to remember when she'd first run into Chris after the funeral, and the timestamp from the store's cameras had helped her piece together those foggy early days of grief. Chris's story about randomly encountering her aligned perfectly with the footage. Every detail of his narrative held up under scrutiny, making my suspicions look like paranoid delusions. The revelation about how Chris had found us came from an unexpected source. My old college roommate called, guilty and apologetic. Months ago, Chris had reached out about planning a high school reunion. He'd been tracking down contact information for everyone, especially those who'd moved away. My roommate had given him my details, including my parents' address, thinking he was helping organize something nice. The reunion never materialized, but Chris had gotten what he needed. When I tried to use this information to show Carol how calculated Chris's arrival was, it backfired spectacularly. The fact that I'd never RSVP'd to any reunion planning made me look antisocial and disconnected from my hometown roots. Chris had been trying to bring people together while I couldn't even respond to an invitation. My vindication became another mark against me. The mailman witnessed my moment of triumph when I thought I'd found proof of Chris's deception. I discovered a discrepancy in some dates Chris had mentioned, and my relief was visible as I stood in the driveway, actually smiling for the first time in days. The mailman, who'd known our family for 20 years, later mentioned to Carol how strange it was to see me celebrating while she was still grieving. Even my small victories were turned into evidence of my callousness. By the end of that second week, the battle lines were clear. Chris and I both understood that this was a zero-sum game. There wasn't room for both of us in Carol's life, not with the narrative he'd constructed. One of us would have to be completely discredited for the other to win. The mother I'd known my whole life was already gone, replaced by Carol, who needed Chris's support to function. The only question was whether I could save her from what was coming, or if I'd lose her completely in the trying. I sat in my rental car that night, parked down the street from my childhood home. Through the windows, I could see Chris and Carol moving around the kitchen, cooking dinner together in perfect synchronization. They looked like a mother and son who'd spent a lifetime building those rhythms. I looked like the outsider I'd become, sitting in the dark, watching the life that used to be mine. Chris started volunteering at Carol's church grief support group the following week. I watched from the parking lot as he carried boxes of tissues and coffee supplies through the side entrance, greeting other volunteers with warm handshakes. Within days, he'd memorized everyone's names and their lost stories. The church secretary later mentioned to Carol how Chris quoted Dad's favorite Bible verse during a particularly moving session, bringing comfort to a newly widowed woman. Carol's eyes filled with tears of pride when she heard this, while I sat there knowing Chris had found that verse highlighted in Dad's old Bible that now sat on his nightstand. The confrontation happened Tuesday evening when Carol was at her book club. Chris and I crossed paths in the hallway, and I finally voiced my suspicions directly. His face transformed from concern to rage, then back to calm calculation within seconds. By the time Carol returned home, we'd both given our versions of events. I described his threats and intimidation. Chris tearfully explained how I'd become violent and irrational, how he'd feared for his safety. Carol's hand trembled as she reached for Chris's arm, choosing comfort over investigation. My phone held evidence I'd been collecting, including screenshots of my old texts to Dad. The messages showed me complaining about family obligations, postponing visits, and prioritizing work over time with him. Chris had somehow accessed these and was now using them in his narrative about my neglect. Each message became ammunition in his campaign to prove I'd never really cared about the family I was now trying to protect. Lily's weekend visits became particularly painful. She developed a habit of asking innocent questions that cut deep. During lunch, she wondered aloud why I hadn't visited Grandpa when he was sick, repeating almost verbatim the accusations Chris had been planting. Her small voice made the words more devastating than any adult confrontation could have been. Carol would pat Lily's hand hand and change the subject, but the damage was already done. The Ring doorbell camera captured everything. One evening, overwhelmed by the situation, I paced the driveway arguing with myself, trying to work through my options out loud. The footage made me look unstable, talking to no one, gesturing wildly. Chris made sure Carol saw it the next day, expressing concern about my mental state. The irony wasn't lost on me that the security system meant to protect the house was now being used to build a case against me. Chris filed for a restraining order the following Monday. The family court mediator treated my concerns as inappropriate boundary violations, especially after Chris presented evidence of my harassment. The temporary order limited my contact with Carol and prohibited me from entering the house when Chris was present. My childhood home became a scheduled visitation, like I was the dangerous one who needed supervision. Dad's old laptop became my lifeline. I remembered his password from years of helping him with technology issues. Late at night in my motel room, I discovered Chris had been corresponding as Carol's family representative with various organizations. Dad's auto signature still appeared at the bottom of emails Chris was sending about estate matters. The calculated precision of his communications revealed someone who'd been planning this for months. The emails showed Chris's careful responses to probate court inquiries about family dynamics. He painted himself as the devoted surrogate son who'd stepped up during a time of need, while I was portrayed as the absent child who only appeared when inheritance was involved. Each email was crafted to build a legal narrative that would be difficult to dispute without looking petty or greedy. Dr. Chen, my therapist from Portland, was subpoenaed to provide testimony about my mental state. During a brief phone consultation, she was forced to confirm that I'd struggled with Dad's death and had expressed difficulty with family changes. Her clinical language about grief processing and adjustment disorders was twisted into evidence of instability. Professional confidentiality meant she couldn't provide context that might have helped. My attempt to record Chris failed spectacularly. During a brief encounter at the grocery store, I tried to capture his threats on my phone. He spotted the recording notification immediately and loudly announced I was illegally surveilling him. When the store manager approached, Chris calmly explained recording laws while I fumbled to defend myself. The incident added another piece to his harassment claim. School pickup became another battlefield. When Chris volunteered to collect Lily after I'd had what he termed an emotional outburst at the house, it established him as the stable family figure. The school added him to the authorized pickup list while expressing concerns about my erratic behavior. Each small victory for Chris meant another door closing for me. Mrs. Patterson's betrayal hurt particularly deeply. After an anonymous complaint about her late property taxes threatened her home, she chose to stay in Chris's good graces rather than support my version of events. She stopped answering my calls and would hurry inside when she saw me approaching. Her whispered apology through the door included the words I'd hear repeatedly: I can't risk losing my home. One night, I discovered Chris sleeping in Dad's study. He was wearing Dad's old Stanford sweatshirt, the one that still carried the faint scent of Dad's cologne. The intimacy of the moment, the calculated way he'd inserted himself into even these private spaces, made me physically ill. When I mentioned it to Carol, she defended it as Chris honoring Dad's memory by keeping his spirit alive in the house. Chris's offer came through Carol, though I knew he'd orchestrated it. If I stopped harassing the family, he would let me say goodbye to Dad's things properly before the estate sale. The implication was clear that continued resistance would mean losing access to even these final memories. When I refused, Carol interpreted it as caring more about objects than Lily's emotional stability, another mark against my character. The grocery store receipt changed everything. While helping Carol organize papers, I found a receipt showing Chris had purchased a sympathy card the day after Dad's obituary appeared in the paper. This contradicted his story about randomly encountering Carol weeks later. But this discovery, which should have vindicated me, only proved Chris had been thoughtful enough to reach out immediately. My suspicious interpretation looked like paranoid jealousy. Dad's work computer at the plant held crucial information. Both Chris and I realized Dad had been documenting concerns about the house and Carol's isolation, but accessing it required different approaches. While I tried to go through proper channels, Chris used Carol's grief to gain authorization. By the time I arrived, the files had been reviewed and interpreted through Chris's lens. The documents revealed Dad's notes asking Chris to help Carol with specific tasks if anything happened. What I saw as evidence of manipulation, others saw as Chris faithfully following Dad's wishes. The narrative shifted again, painting Chris as the dutiful executor of Dad's final requests, while I appeared to be selfishly fighting against Dad's own plans. Janet faced an impossible choice. Carol's sister could see the truth in my concerns, but risked losing access to Lily if she supported me. During a tearful phone call, she admitted she couldn't lose her granddaughter too. Family loyalty meant nothing when weighed against Chris's growing control over Carol's decisions. Janet chose silence, another ally neutralized. My investigation tactics grew desperate. I started manipulating Carol's church friends, using guilt trips and emotional appeals to gather information about Chris. Each conversation left me feeling more like the villain Chris painted me as. The secretary at Chris's workplace fell for my manufactured story about needing employment verification for a surprise gift. I photographed personnel files while making small talk about grief, hating myself for the deception. Dad's shared cloud account contained evidence before Chris realized it existed. The files showed Dad's growing concerns about Carol's isolation and vulnerability, but obtaining this information required violating password protections and privacy expectations. Every piece of evidence I gathered came tainted with ethical compromises that undermined its value. Uncle Robert arrived from out of state with his own agenda. Dad's brother wanted the workshop tools and demanded real family control over the estate. Fighting a war on two fronts meant missing Lily's school play, which Chris attended in my place. The custody evaluation noted my absence as another example of unreliable family support. Chris's calculated presence at every event contrasted sharply with my forced absences. My credit cards maxed out from lawyer consultation fees, while Chris had full access to Carol's accounts for household management. The financial disparity affected everything from my ability to gather evidence to my basic daily needs. Living in an extended stay motel while Chris occupied my childhood room created a visual narrative of belonging versus intrusion. The confrontation at Dad's favorite diner traumatized the waitress who'd known our family for decades. My desperate attempt to explain the situation in public made me look unhinged. She called Carol afterward, concerned about my behavior. Another community member added to the growing chorus of people worried about my mental state rather than Chris's manipulation. My freelance work suffered as the family drama consumed my attention. Missed deadlines and distracted communication led to contract termination. The replacement designer, I later learned, was Chris's former coworker. Even my professional life became contaminated by his influence. The loss of income further limited my options for fighting back. Carol's plea broke something inside me. She begged me to let Dad rest in peace instead of making his death about my jealousy. Her tears were genuine, her pain real. I was torturing her during the worst time of her life, regardless of my intentions. Chris stood behind her, offering silent support, the son she needed while I'd become the source of additional grief. The church secretary's marriage strained under the weight of my investigation. Questions about her sharing information with me led to arguments with her husband. Her disabled son asked why people were angry at Mommy, adding guilt to my growing collection of collateral damage. Each person I involved in my quest for truth paid a price I hadn't calculated. Dr. Chen asked the question that haunted me during our final session. What if Chris genuinely loved Carol and I was sabotaging her happiness? My inability to immediately answer revealed the doubt creeping into my certainty. The possibility that I might be wrong, that my actions were causing unnecessary pain, became another weight to carry. Standing before the church congregation, I publicly admitted my failures as a son. The confession was strategic, meant to maintain credibility about present concerns, but the words were true. I had prioritized work over family, missed important moments, taken Dad's presence for granted. Chris sat in the front row, nodding sympathetically, playing the forgiving brother to perfection. The evidence I'd gathered revealed more than Chris's manipulation. It showed I'd missed Dad's final call because I was on a date. The timestamp mocked me, proof that I'd chosen personal pleasure over what became my last chance to hear his voice. Chris somehow knew this detail and used it in his narrative about my priorities. Chris's lawyer filed an emergency motion advancing the probate hearing by months. My lawyer was attending his daughter's wedding, leaving me scrambling for representation. The accelerated timeline favored Chris's position as the stable, present family member over my chaotic attempts at intervention. Legal momentum shifted decisively in his direction. During a moment of unexpected vulnerability, Chris revealed his true motivations. He'd grown up with an abusive father, always envying the family I'd taken for granted. His desire to become Carol's real son mixed genuine care with desperate entitlement. The complexity of his emotions didn't excuse his actions, but explained the intensity of his campaign. Saving Carol required becoming someone I didn't recognize. I manipulated Lily's trust during a family dinner, using her innocent affection to access Chris's phone. The betrayal of a child's confidence marked a new low in my transformation from protective son to calculating strategist. Each victory came at the cost of another piece of my identity. Chris's tears at Dad's grave were genuine. I watched from a distance as he knelt by the headstone, shoulders shaking with real grief. We were both crying for the same loss, both seeking to fill the same void. The shared pain made our conflict more tragic, two damaged people destroying each other over the love of one grieving woman. The minor legal victory felt hollow. A technicality in filing procedures gave me temporary advantage, but Chris's emotional hold on Carol remained unshaken. He'd built relationships while I'd focused on evidence. His integration into the family's daily life mattered more than any document I could produce. Everything depended on Carol's testimony about her wishes for the future. Both Chris and I knew the final decision rested with her, not the courts. The woman who'd raised me, who'd loved me unconditionally, would have to choose between the son she'd born and the son she'd chosen. The weight of that choice was destroying her as much as our conflict. Chris's young nephew became an unwitting weapon. The child's innocent question about why I was being mean to Uncle Chris cut deeper than any legal argument. Children's voices carried moral weight that adult accusations couldn't match. Chris had built relationships with extended family, while I'd remained a stranger to cousins and relatives. Carol's workplace became divided as colleagues chose sides based on their own family situations. Those who'd experienced caregiver burnout sympathized with Chris. Those who'd dealt with family manipulation saw my perspective. The office dynamics shifted as personal drama infected professional relationships. Carol's stress affected her work performance, adding another layer of consequence. The family court system wasn't designed for cases like ours. Custody disputes had clear frameworks, but emotional manipulation without physical harm fell into gray areas. The legal tools available didn't match the psychological complexity of Chris's campaign. I discovered that being right didn't guarantee justice within institutional limitations. Dad's professional contacts provided limited help. Decades of friendship yielded character references, but not active involvement. Those who owed Dad favors honored them minimally, afraid of deeper entanglement in family drama. The social capital Dad had built over a lifetime offered sympathy, but not substantial support. The revelation about Dad's prior knowledge reframed everything. He'd known Chris was struggling financially and had planned to help him find work. Dad's kindness had opened the door Chris eventually walked through. The tragedy wasn't just manipulation, but the exploitation of genuine compassion. Dad's good intentions had created the vulnerability Chris exploited. The help Dad had planned for Chris became clearer through his former supervisor at the plant. Tom McTheodore pulled me aside after I'd spent hours searching through Dad's work emails. He explained how Dad had noticed Chris hanging around the hardware store looking desperate, counting change for basic supplies. Dad had arranged for Chris to interview for an entry-level position, wanting to help someone clearly struggling. The kindness that defined my father had inadvertently created the opening Chris exploited. Dad's compassion reframed the tragedy without excusing Chris's actions. The work emails I finally accessed showed Dad's growing concern about Chris's intensity around Carol. One message to Tom described Chris asking detailed questions about Carol's daily routine, her favorite foods, her medical conditions. Dad had written about feeling uneasy, but choosing to believe Chris simply cared about helping. The timestamp showed this email was sent 2 weeks before Dad's death. I sat in the plant's break room studying printouts of Dad's correspondence. Each page revealed another piece of Chris's calculated approach. Dad had documented Chris's financial struggles, his questions about the house's value, his interest in Carol's isolation. The evidence painted a picture of exploitation wrapped in genuine need. Chris hadn't lied about struggling. He'd simply weaponized his circumstances. The cost of obtaining this evidence weighed heavily. I'd violated Dad's privacy, reading his fears about dying, his worries about leaving Carol alone. One email to Tom mentioned nightmares about Carol being taken advantage of after he was gone. Dad had seen the danger, but chosen hope over suspicion. His final act of trust had become Chris's greatest weapon. I drove to the courthouse with the evidence organized chronologically. The security guard recognized me from previous visits, his expression mixing pity with wariness. I'd become a familiar sight in these halls, the son fighting a battle most people didn't understand. The metal detector beeped at my keys, another small delay in an endless process. The probate clerk's office smelled like old paper and disappointment. I submitted my formal request to review Chris's filings, knowing the process would take days. The clerk, a woman who'd processed my parents' marriage license decades ago, avoided eye contact as she stamped the forms. Even here, Chris's narrative about my instability had taken root. While waiting for document access, I discovered Chris's critical mistake. His notarized statement about first meeting Carol contained specific dates that contradicted the grocery store receipts I'd found. The timeline discrepancy was small, but undeniable. Chris had claimed their first post-funeral encounter happened 3 weeks after Dad's death, but the sympathy card receipt proved he'd made contact within 24 hours. The documentary evidence felt hollow compared to the emotional damage already inflicted. Carol's trust in me had eroded beyond simple repair. Chris's lies could be proven, but the relationships he'd built remained real. The community had embraced him as Carol's savior, while viewing me as the disruptive son who'd abandoned her. Truth and perception had diverged beyond reconciliation. I spent the night before the hearing in my motel room, organizing evidence into a presentation that focused on facts rather than accusations. Each document received a simple label explaining its significance. The goal was proving deception without attacking Chris's character, showing the court patterns of manipulation while acknowledging his genuine struggles. Dad would have wanted compassion, even now. The morning of the hearing arrived with unexpected frost. I scraped ice from my rental car's windshield, hands shaking from more than cold. The courthouse steps seemed steeper than before, each one requiring conscious effort. Inside, the hallway filled with familiar faces choosing sides through their seating arrangements. Church friends, neighbors, and extended family created an inadvertent map of allegiances. Carol arrived with Chris, their synchronized movements showing months of practiced routine. routine. She wore the black dress from Dad's funeral, a choice that felt deliberately symbolic. Chris guided her with a protective hand on her elbow, whispering what appeared to be reassurances. They sat in the front row, surrounded by supporters who glared at me with protective hostility. The judge entered precisely at 9, her expression revealing nothing about preliminary reviews. I recognized her from community events, a woman who'd known our family peripherally for years. She called for order with practiced efficiency, establishing ground rules that emphasized factual presentation over emotional appeals. The framework favored documentation over narrative, a small advantage for my prepared evidence. Chris's lawyer presented first, painting a picture of devoted caregiving and family dysfunction. The narrative felt rehearsed but effective, each point supported by witness statements and behavioral documentation. Chris sat quietly throughout, occasionally reaching over to pat Carol's hand. His performance of concerned son was flawless, years of studying our family paying off in subtle gestures. My turn came with the documentary evidence. I presented the timeline discrepancies methodically, showing how Chris's sworn statements contradicted physical evidence. The grocery store receipts, the sympathy card purchase, the dates in Dad's emails all created an undeniable pattern. The judge studied each document carefully, asking clarifying questions that revealed she understood the implications. The room's atmosphere shifted as patterns emerged. Chris's carefully constructed timeline unraveled through receipts and timestamps. Several supporters began whispering, comparing what they'd been told with what documents proved. The collective realization spread slowly, like dawn breaking over a landscape of deception. Even Carol's expression showed cracks of doubt. Chris's composure finally broke during the presentation of Dad's work emails. As I read Dad's concerns about Chris's intensity, his questions about Carol's finances, his documentation of suspicious behavior, Chris began breathing rapidly. His hands gripped the table edge, knuckles white with tension. The same panic attack performance from our kitchen played out before the court, but this time the context had changed. The judge called for a recess, during which Chris's nephew's mother approached me in the hallway. She explained how Chris had been asking her son to call him uncle and discussing joining their family properly. Her protective instincts had activated, recognizing patterns from Chris's past relationships. She agreed to testify about his history of attaching to vulnerable families. When proceedings resumed, Chris's psychological state became the focus. His lawyer attempted damage control, but Chris himself began speaking rapidly about deserving a real family, about years of watching others have what he'd never received. His words tumbled out in a stream of genuine pain, mixed with entitled rage. The mask had finally slipped completely, revealing the damaged person beneath the calculated performance. The judge ordered immediate psychological evaluations for all parties involved. The mandate included Chris, Carol, and myself, acknowledging the trauma inflicted on everyone. She specifically noted concerns about Chris's persistent delusional attachment patterns and Carol's vulnerability to manipulation during grief. The clinical language felt both validating and devastating. Chris's breakdown accelerated as consequences materialized. He began sobbing about just wanting a mother who loved him, about being tired of being alone, about deserving the family I'd thrown away. The raw honesty of his pain didn't excuse his actions, but explained them. Everyone in the courtroom witnessed the collision between genuine need and destructive behavior. Carol's testimony came last, her voice barely audible as she described the confusion of recent months. She admitted feeling lost after Dad's death, grateful for Chris's help, but increasingly uncomfortable with his intensity. She looked at me while describing how my absence had created a void Chris had eagerly filled. The acknowledgement felt like a knife, but her growing awareness of manipulation provided hope. The judge's preliminary ruling established immediate boundaries. Chris was prohibited from unsupervised contact with Carol pending psychological evaluation. Financial oversight was mandated for estate matters. Supervised visitation with Lily was ordered, protecting the child while maintaining family connections. Each restriction felt necessary but tragic, acknowledging Chris as both victim and perpetrator. I was offered the opportunity to influence Chris's treatment recommendations. The choice felt impossible, weighing justice against compassion. Dad's voice echoed in my memory, always choosing kindness even when it cost him. I requested comprehensive therapy rather than punitive measures, asking the court to address Chris's underlying trauma rather than just punishing his actions. The immediate aftermath was chaos. Chris's supporters divided between those feeling betrayed and those defending him despite evidence. Carol seemed smaller somehow, realizing how thoroughly she'd been manipulated while grieving. The community that had united against me now fractured along lines of belief and disbelief. Truth had won, but victory felt hollow. Legal protections were established quickly. Carol's accounts required dual authorization. The house title was protected from changes. A social worker was assigned to monitor the situation. Each safeguard represented a failure of trust, necessary barriers between a mother and someone she'd grown to love as a son. The practical requirements of protection felt like additional losses. Chris faced supervised treatment at a facility specializing in attachment disorders. His genuine breakdown had convinced the court that punishment without treatment would only perpetuate cycles of harm. He would receive help while being prevented from causing additional damage. The solution felt inadequate but necessary, addressing illness while protecting victims. Carol and I began the slow process of rebuilding through mandatory family counseling. The sessions were painful, full of accusations and apologies in equal measure. We sat in uncomfortable chairs discussing how grief had made us vulnerable to different kinds of harm. The therapist guided us through recognizing patterns, establishing boundaries, and accepting permanent changes to our relationship. The community slowly adjusted to the new reality. Church potlucks felt different, with unspoken divisions between those who'd enabled Chris and those who'd seen through him. Some relationships never recovered, trust broken by choosing sides in a conflict that had no true winners. The social fabric of our small town bore permanent tears from the manipulation that had thrived in our midst. 6 months later, I helped Carol sort through Dad's things properly. We worked in companionable silence, occasionally sharing memories or tears. The house felt different now, marked by Chris's absence but also by hard-won awareness. Carol had installed new locks and security cameras, practical reminders of vulnerability. We were both forever changed, warier but perhaps wiser. Chris sent letters from treatment, alternating between apology and accusation. The facility reported progress in addressing his attachment disorders and trauma history. He was building genuine therapeutic relationships, learning healthier ways to seek connection. The reports felt hopeful despite everything, suggesting healing was possible even for those who'd caused profound harm. I returned to Portland eventually, but the definition of home had shifted. Regular video calls with Carol replaced the previous distance. We'd established new patterns of connection, born from nearly losing each other entirely. The relationship was different, marked by intentional effort rather than assumed bonds. We'd learned that family required active choice, not just blood or proximity. The financial settlements proceeded slowly but fairly. Chris's claims were dismissed, but he received assistance for treatment costs. Dad's estate was distributed according to his original will, protecting Carol's future while acknowledging the exploitation she'd endured. The legal resolution felt anticlimactic after months of emotional warfare, simple documents ending complex devastation. Lily struggled to understand why Uncle Chris couldn't visit anymore. Janet and Carol worked together to explain boundaries and safety in age-appropriate ways. The child's confusion reminded everyone that Chris's manipulation had touched even the youngest family members. Healing would take generations, ripple effects of one man's desperate need for belonging. The house stood as testament to everything that had transpired. Chris's work workshop became a guest room again, painted neutral colors that erased his presence. The kitchen faucet he'd installed worked perfectly, a functional reminder of how help could become control. Carol learned to accept assistance from others, but with new awareness of potential costs. Years would pass before trust felt natural again. Carol developed friendships with other widows who understood grief without exploitation. She volunteered at the same support group where Chris had infiltrated her life, using her experience to help others recognize manipulation. Her story became a cautionary tale told gently, warning without condemning those who'd simply tried to help. I learned to forgive myself for the distance that had created opportunity for Chris's manipulation. Therapy helped address the guilt of prioritizing career over family, the regret of missed moments with Dad. The work was ongoing, accepting responsibility while recognizing that Chris's actions were his own choice. Healing meant holding multiple truths simultaneously. The town's memory of events faded gradually, replaced by new dramas and different scandals. Chris became a cautionary tale told in whispers, the man who'd tried to steal a family through kindness. Some still defended him, unable to reconcile the helpful neighbor with the calculating manipulator. Truth remained complicated, refusing simple categories of villain and victim. Legal protections remained in place, permanent reminders of temporary vulnerability. Carol's finances stayed secure through oversight that felt both restrictive and necessary. The house's deed included provisions preventing future exploitation. Each safeguard represented lessons learned through profound cost. Security came through accepting that trust required verification. Chris completed treatment and relocated to another state, court orders preventing return. Reports indicated he'd found employment and was building appropriate relationships through continued therapy. His story ended not with punishment, but with possibility for redemption elsewhere. Distance provided safety for everyone involved, allowing healing without continued contact. The final estate matters resolved quietly. Dad's workshop tools went to a vocational school in his memory, helping struggling young people learn trades. His golf membership was sold, proceeds funding Carol's future security. Each decision honored his memory while acknowledging how his possessions had been weaponized. Legacy became about more than objects, focusing on values that couldn't be stolen. Carol found peace in small routines that belonged only to her. Morning coffee on the porch, evening walks with neighbors who'd proven trustworthy, weekly calls with family who'd stood by her. She rebuilt life on her own terms, grateful for support, but no longer dependent on any single person. Strength grew from surviving manipulation, wisdom from recognizing it. I visited regularly but maintained healthy boundaries. Our relationship evolved into something new, neither the distant connection of before nor the crisis-forced intensity of the conflict. We were mother and son who'd survived a unique trauma, bonded by experience but respectful of individual healing needs. Love persisted, transformed but unbroken. The story ended not with dramatic justice but with quiet adaptation. Evil wasn't vanquished, it was treated and relocated. Victims weren't made whole, they learned to live with scars. The community didn't unite in condemnation, it fractured and slowly reformed around new understandings. Reality refused the clean endings fiction provided, offering instead the complex hope of humans learning to protect each other better. Dad's grave became a place of reflection rather than conflict. Both Chris and I had mourned there, seeking different things from the same loss. The headstone bore witness to love exploited and trust betrayed, but also to compassion that persisted despite profound harm. In the end, Dad's greatest legacy was teaching us that choosing kindness required wisdom about when and how to extend it. Life continued with new awareness. Carol aged with appropriate support systems, protected but not isolated. I built my own family with hard-won knowledge about boundaries and trust. The town moved forward, carrying lessons about grief's vulnerability and community's responsibility. Chris existed somewhere beyond our borders, hopefully healing rather than seeking new targets. Justice came through understanding rather than punishment. Chris faced his trauma with professional help. Carol reclaimed her autonomy with appropriate support. I released guilt while accepting responsibility. The community learned vigilance without paranoia. Everyone bore scars, but scars could teach if we let them. The ending wasn't happy, but it was real, and in its reality lay the possibility for genuine healing.